We've talked a lot about public spaces and public places, and we've talked a lot about technology. When I look at that whole issue, one of the concerns I have is that I look at Facebook, I look at what happens on Apple, I look at what happens over Google, and all of a sudden I see these public places are all controlled by private groups. And so I guess one of the questions here is that although we've kind of talked about these public places as if they're the square in the medieval town that we're going to come and talk to, but our public place doesn't quite look like that anymore, and it's not dominated by a group that we cooperate over, etc. It's dominated by a set of private organizations. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I kind of question what role they play and how they play roles that manage our public spaces. So I think this affects the question of urban organization, urban questions, and the fact that we've been using this as a basis for some of our discussion of urban issues. So I'll leave it at that and let them respond, and you go ahead.
Okay. Shall we listen to response first, and I go ahead and... Or shall I comment your comment? I don't agree about what you're saying, that we have a decrease of the importance of public space. You have to go to Europe, maybe in America, but I would say it's increasing in many ways.
I don't think it's decreasing in most of the U.S. either, but there are. I mean, I think let's just sort of think conceptually about this. So there's one idea which is public, which means owned and managed by the public sector. There's another idea which is shared, right? So shared can be, internal. It can be a shared space, can be entirely within a company, entirely within an organization, but often it's a place in which ideas are spread within that area. The space can be open versus regulated, open versus limited. Now, typically public spaces are open. Typically private spaces have some form of price on them. A pub has some kind of price on it versus not. But of course, you can have a public space that is priced, right? I mean, when Singapore puts congestion road pricing, they're pricing what is otherwise public space. In fact, I'm quite enthusiastic about that pricing of public spaces. And then the last one is sort of what's the function of the public space, right? Much of our public spaces in cities are passageways, right? They're actually places that we're not actually trying to get there. We're trying to use it to go somewhere else. Sometimes it creates delights. I mean, walking down a beautiful urban street can be enormously, it's not just about getting there, it's about the joy of getting there. Sometimes it can be awful, like the drive home that I'm about to do in 45 minutes and public space. But, in any case, it's a passageway versus a destination, right, versus a place that you're actually going to go there, like the alcoholic park where someone worked hard to go to get in that lovely place where someone would let them drink in peace. And then, of course, Hans raised the issue of sort of the centrality of the spot, which also seems really important. So, the spots which are global destinations, which often the fact that we don't price public spaces often creates problems. I mean, I sort of, the economist in me, shivers about the fact that we don't price Piazza San Marco, right? That we don't actually, at least put some limitation on people abusing one of the great patrimonium mundials versus neighborhood spaces, which are as Sita has reminded us, and I think back to my just a personal anecdote. My closest friend as a child was Swedish. He was the son of the Swedish ambassador to the UN Security Council, and he lived in my building. But we met in the park. Right? Or more precisely, our parents met in the park. And that story has been repeated, as Seth will tell me, that there have been, not only has it been repeated thousands of times, there have been literally hundreds of articles published in important sociology journals documenting the fact that that's been important.
And those relationships have endured.
Indeed.
And there are economists who have tried to put a price on public space. And out at the Getty Center, they had a couple of conferences on trying to value the non-tangible. I mean, if you really want to measure it, which is not my goal, there are some people doing it. So is that going to solve our problem? Will that help?
Well, managing the space helps. And just to get back to your original point, which is, are we losing public spaces? I think in any reasonable inventory of the proper spaces, they're not going down typically. But it may be that we have moved increasingly our social activity to spaces that are not purely public from spaces that were. So it's not sort of the acreage has not necessarily fallen down, but we may have allocated ourselves more to semi-public space. And the last thing I think that feels really central when I think about public spaces that are really successful in the 21st century, they are programmed. Okay, there is somebody who is actually watching them, making them safe, putting stuff in them. And if you had time, if you went down to the Boston Innovation District, which has a whole bunch of public spaces which has been put in, you know, they have yoga going on from 11 to 12. They have whatever. It's all free, but it's all programmed. And there's some local property tax surplus that is programming to get the human and the social capital to match up with the physical capital. So,
may I just comment what you said, that people are running around in the city? There are several categories that actually hang out in the city. The seniors, the undesirable, the unemployed, immigrant, asylum seekers, students, parents with small children, etc. So we have people actually spending time in public space, not just moving around. So we have different perspective on this. Another comment, no one has brought up streets. Streets are the most important public space that we have.
Ed did bring up streets a minute ago. No,
okay.
Ed did just now, yeah.
May I just...
I'd like to
just
yeah, sure.
Play it out?
Yeah,
You and Habitat have a very good research department, and they published a report a few years ago called Streets as Public Spaces and Drivers of Urban Prosperity. Have any of you read that report? Yeah. It is comparison between 100 cities regarding the street network. And they're using 3 indicators for deciding that. That is the length of the street, the area covered by the streets, and the number of crossings. And with those 3 indicators, you actually can capture morphological differences between historical cities and more modernist planned cities. And they found a very strong correlation between productivity and a good street network, which is the most important public space. So I think you as a regional scientist, you must come down a little bit on ground and check the morphological differences between cities. That is my point.
Okay, I was going to raise this point that Ed raised and Peter has just raised, this question about our definition of public space. I think it's far too narrow in terms of what's been said today. It's much broader in the sense that most open space, which is public space in cities, is in fact streets, basically. Now, in central London, this is probably about 20 years old, this statistic, somebody calculated or measured that 40% of people moving at any one time during the working day, 9 to 5, 40% of people moving were walking, okay? So if you count people on subway systems, buses and so on, trains, etc., then it's a percentage of that. And that's largely because in a place like a big city like central London, you've got 2 million people basically working in the city and West End and the government quarter, Victoria and so on, and maybe even Canary Wharf as far as that. But so you've got 2 million people in that context. And a large number of people, I think, who are walking, the 40% who are walking, are indeed enjoying the public space in some sense. And indeed that is increasing because of the municipalities are changing that public space quite a lot. I mean, there's a lot of bike lanes going in, for example, and pavements, or what you call sidewalks here, are being actually extended and so on. So to some extent, all of this is a kind of public space. And as you said, there are some really great streets. I mean, you made the point about the great streets, and I think there's a lot of work which relates to this conception of space. I mean, Holly White, is it, who wrote about streets in New York City, and then there's a whole string of books written by people in urban design. In our own group in UCL, or the related group in the architecture school, the Space Syntax group, I mean, they've made an industry almost out about thinking about the morphology of cities in terms of streets. You don't think of it in terms of streets, you think of it in terms of connected spaces, in some sense, convex spaces. So I think that this is a really important issue to actually broaden the concept of public space in terms of the physical definition of it, and then, of course, the non-physical definition of public space, which has been raised by a number of people, I think is also exceptionally important to map that onto it.
Peter?
Yeah, I think I might just voice a few different opinions. Much of our discussion has been on what is the city, prompted also by some of the challenging remarks of Peter Elmland. Much less has been discussed the question, why do we need cities? And economists, of course, could always say, well, have agglomeration advantage, etc. But cities have not always been there in the history of mankind. The city is a rather recent phenomenon in the history. And what I understood when I was in preparation of this meeting, reading again once more Max Weber on the city, it was very interesting. He recognized all the agglomeration advantages. He was also taught by his brother Alfred, etc. But he said, first you need a social constellation, an urban culture, an urban habitus, and then gradually the city might start to grow. And then somewhere there is a distinction between people who really like to live in the city, the urbanists, etc., the deep desire to live with other people. But in many cases, and that's the way he looked into it, people went by necessity into the city after the Industrial Revolution. And people had to conglomerate because the major industries were there and people were forced to go there. Now, being forced to live in a city leads to a totally different culture and a different perception of what the city should be. And even nowadays, if you look into old districts as a result of Industrial Revolution more than 150 years ago, they still have an own status and sometimes very different behaviors compared to the ones who perhaps wanted to be in the city. On the other hand, we have a counterexample that is interesting, and also in relation to public space. Several years ago, I was in Beersheba. Now you see, Ben Gurion has once pronounced, "We will make the desert green." And he did it, and if you go to Beersheba nowadays, a modern city, not too nice, but it's a modern city, it's fine. But when I was there in the 80s, when it was just recently built, they had to get rid of all the Bedouins. And the Bedouins were using public space all over because they were just with their camels and sheep, etc., and their tents. And that was not allowed anymore. So they were forced, the Bedouins in the vicinity of Beersheba, to put them in the city. The people didn't want to at all. They hated the city. They were put there. And I still remember, I still have a picture. This was forced migration into the city. The people, and you know what they did? They had these two-story houses and a garden behind. It was nice. It was rather spacious. But it was very interesting. The Bedouins had put their tents in the garden and living still in tents in the garden, and they had put the animals, including the camels, in the house. And some they were sticking with their neck out the windows, etc. So, and that's why, in fact, it's an illustration of what Max Weber said. There ought to be an urban culture. If there is an urban culture, cities will grow forever. If there is no urban culture, at the end you will certainly get a counter movement. And in a way that is linked also to public space. Because if it is a forced movement, who cares about public space? And the example given by Hans on Stockholm was interesting. Because in a way one ought to make a distinction there between social interaction and social capital. Your King's Garden, beautiful place in the summer. Of course you can go there, have a drink, and you meet with people. And you might talk, but you will never see them again. That social interaction is not what I would call social capital. Your alcohol addicts, just opposite Sheraton in the other place, which you also know. But it's a close community. And I can tell you, I once tried to sit there. I was not welcome. I was sent away. Because it's their territory. At the end, it's not public space. It's officially public space, but they have created their own community, almost a privatization of public space with their own habits. Unless I would come as a drunken person with a bottle of vodka, perhaps I might be welcome, otherwise I would not. And we have many of these places. I have the same in Amsterdam and Utrecht and Delft. I have seen all these places. You are not welcome. So public space, and that's I think is my argument in the end, needs a very careful definition. Public space does not mean free access and equal opportunities for everyone. And then we need segmented spaces, and that is a matter of urban policy.
So, I'll let you in.
Oh, okay. I don't want to interrupt.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Antonia.
No, I have mostly a question, so not much comment. So it's about the activities and the uses that we have of the public space. So the question is, are we losing public spaces, or how are we using public space, and how can we enhance the social capital in the public through the public space? Is it possible? Is there any relationship? So I would focus on the uses and activities of the public space that are made in the public space. So, for example, the activities. Are there any activities there that are able to enhance the social capital? For example, celebrations. I don't know. So, which activities can bring the people together, not only for talking and then having no relationship after, but for example, the celebrations or the traditions of the neighborhoods can convey this density of relationship that can last longer than talk. And which other activities, which other uses can convey can enhance the social capital? For example, community activities, community hubs, or productive activities that could be fab labs, or I don't know, some different kinds of co-production or co-working spaces. I ask myself actually. Is there any research demonstrating if whether some activities are able to enhance the social capital through the public space, through the interaction between private spaces and public space together? So these are questions that I'm very interested in researching more about it, and I thank all of you for putting these ideas on
Can
the
I
table.
just offer a small reflection also in response to what Seta, who's just outside, but it doesn't matter. Because there are a couple of things where economists at least can do a good job. First of all, they can at least estimate the user value of public space, looking into revealed preference techniques on the one hand, or contingent valuation methods and conjoint analysis, etc. There is a whole range of different techniques, statistically verified and econometrically well justified, I think, which could help us at least to assess the economic value of public spaces, looking into different types of visitors and user categories, etc. That's number one. Number two, there's also the externality involved, because public space is not only for the users visiting the public space, there is also the externality in the sense that in many cases, especially when the public space is a historical public space, then of course the value of real estate around that public space is increasing. We've done quite some research using space electrometric modeling techniques on the value added of houses and dwellings in a city located near historical public spaces. And the extra value is rather high compared to, let's say, the average housing price. It's about 22 to 27%. So there's a value capturing mechanism involved, because that's important for policy. If you support a good quality of public space, it has externalities for the surroundings, and given real estate taxes, etc., in the longer run, it certainly pays off to invest in good public spaces, and a good policymaker entrepreneur after 20 years will make money out of good maintenance of public spaces and historical places in the city.
Ed, may I ask you, I saw somewhere that you are a part of an initiative around small firms in America. Did I get it right? I saw your name, something.
Well, I've certainly written things on small firms over the last 25 or 30 years, but I'm not sure which report. We worked on there was an initiative in Boston around an entrepreneurship zone. Maybe that's what you're.
That's maybe what I. So I have a question about small firms, because in our time, cities are very important habitat for small firms. And you seldom see policies addressing this issue. And if you look at immigrant businesses in Europe, we know for a fact that they are doing much better if they have access to traditional streets than if they are segregated in new towns, like they are in Stockholm. So immigrants in London, same type of immigrants, settle down south of Thames in typical city fabric, or in Birmingham. They're doing much better as entrepreneurs. Also forgotten by I never hear any kind of political discussion about that.
So that's exactly what motivated this. I co-chaired it with the economic development chief for the city of Boston, and it was partially motivated by the gulf between wealth and poverty within Boston, in the sense that Boston had enough resources that it could actually be doing something about it. It wasn't very successful as a committee, in part because we had about 8 politicians on the committee, all of whom wanted to argue about the borders of the zone, not what would actually go into the zone. So that was an excruciatingly painful part of this conversation. But really, there were a couple of ideas associated with it, one of which was one-stop permitting. So, I think I mentioned this yesterday, but I have a very strong view that one of the, great tragedies of America is that we regulate rich person's entrepreneurship so much more lightly than we regulate poor person's entrepreneurship. So the idea was having one-stop permitting with people who spoke the language of the immigrants, right? And the virtue of having one-stop permitting is you can also actually have expectations about how quickly you'll get to the permitting. This is not a new thing. When Fort Devens in Massachusetts became the town of Devens, when the Army left, they created something called the Devens Enterprise Commission, which basically had the power to do one-stop permitting there. So that was viable. The second thing was there's a large community college within the area that we were talking about. There's the largest vocational school within Boston there. So the idea was to try and match together the regulatory relief with some sort of targeted vocational training. There are lots of different ways to do vocational training. The U.S. does most of them pretty badly, and in almost any way we do it, it's pretty much of a failure. But our Madison Park High School, which is the vocational school within Boston, which is a monster school, it's huge, and it's a complete disaster. And I thought there was some potential for doing things that were more targeted, competitively sourced vocational training, where you had people who were actually competing on doing computer-related skills, competing on doing service sector skills, and so forth. And the beauty of vocational training is you can actually evaluate the quality of it immediately upon finishing for a lot of it, right? You know if the person's been trained to be a plumber, right? You know if the person can do it. You don't have to wait 10 years and see the IRS records to do that. So that was one idea, is doing more skills. And the third, of course, was just a physical space, and that does exist. There is a Roxbury Innovation Center right now. It does, both have space for entrepreneurs and do programming for the neighborhood. And again, it's a shared community space based on the original innovation district downtown, but the key is it is programmed, that there's a person whose job it is to make sure that the thing works, that it's inclusive in the community, and that it brings people in. So that was very much of the model of this. And I've always been dubious about programs that create zones which are artificially subsidizing people to locate in the zones, and that's very much not what this was. This was more an idea that you're going to try something, you're going to try a bunch of vocational training, you're going to try a bunch of new regulatory stuff, and if it works, let it spread. Whereas if what you're trying to do is just bribe people to locate in an area, that's robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Can I ask maybe Ed a question to share some of his experiences with us? You have worked extensively also in developing countries, as I sometimes also have done. Part of the public space is streets. That's also what you have mentioned. Streets are very important. Well, most of the new entrepreneurs coming in, street vendors, etc., they use that public space. And there's always a conflict between the private shop owners being in private properties and the street vendors all over the city center, selling all their products and competing with the private sector, which is just 1 meter separated from them on the sidewalks.
Some people, of course, written rules, it's accessible, but still, it's not accessible regarding the unwritten rules. How do you measure them?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's an important issue.
We have another.
Exactly. I'm not welcome.
Right.
too many,
I wanted to be welcome.
Too many things to manage all at the same time. Look, Karima, your idea about public spaces and trying to figure out what's public and what isn't really has a lot to do with the social ecology of these spaces and how they're being used, I think. And maybe that's a way to think about your concerns about what relates to what in those settings.
Okay. How are we in time?
I think it's time.
It's 1 minute. So
I just want to reiterate that we really should be clear on what we should decide. We don't have to decide now what our words are, right? So I tend to think that public means owned by the public sector, whereas open is a word which means that it can be commonly used. So I think it's useful to actually distinguish those two bits.
Yeah, that's
Definitely. One more? There? Give away the mic.
Thank you. So my question is that we live in a world, the digital economy, and it seems that cities have now a unique opportunity, right? A very, very important resource today is generating data. And the cities have the unique ability to generate all sort of data about who is using the public space, how are they using it, and that data is becoming economically very important for firms, for individuals. So what are the opportunities that you see and the challenges that you see for considering a city as a market for information, as a market for knowledge?
Okay, Kingsley, shall we wrap it up? Or no? Shall you? I will challenge, you talk about Facebook and social media, but in social media you actually interact with people who think like yourself in sort of a filter bubble. And you often hear, you can read it in papers nowadays, that the political role of the physical public space is diminishing. It is not the Greek agora anymore. I would say the opposite. The political role of physical public space is just growing. We maybe don't give political speeches there, but we see each other. We see different styles, behaviors, races. We see if it's secure or not. Our political opinions is very often based on how we perceive the physical public space. And the more we're using it, the more important it is.
What about the non-physical shared space that's going on? And if you don't think that's playing a very powerful role, you're very foolish.
Yeah, no, it plays a powerful role, but it's another system, because you don't interact with people who disagree with you as you do in public space. That's my point.